for this piece, which is called The Migration of the Negro, although it is now referred to as the Great Migration or the Migration, this series is painted by Jacob Lawrence, who is an African American painter that flourished during the Harlem Renaissance and was later subsidized by the WPA, which I'll talk about in a second. But in order to understand Jacob Lawrence, we really need to go and talk about the history of racism and segregation that is prominent in the United States history. So during the World War I, even a few years before World War I, but especially during World War I, there was this great need for labor since so many men were drafted into the military to fight in Europe, and they didn't really have any African American units that fought like they did in World War II. So in order to fill all of these industrial jobs, there's going to be lots of need for people to move north. So the top panel you're seeing, this one up here, which says number 1 next to it, the titles of each one of these panels that we're seeing here, this is kind of all of them, there was 60 of them total, but number 1 is there was a great need for labor with the beginning of World War I. So he titles each one of these pieces and how it relates to what he's painting. So this one on the top looks like a bunch of African American people that are going to be getting onto trains and headed for distant areas, including Chicago, New York, St. Louis. It's hard to move, especially if your whole family is in the South. And so moving, it did mean greater opportunity in regards to jobs, but it didn't necessarily stop the racism that they were experiencing in the South. So that's one of the themes that Jacob Lawrence is going to show throughout his migration series, is that the racial divide between African Americans and the rest of the population. So Lawrence was trained at the Harlem Community Center when he was young. He went to it was a small private art school too, and he is going to really be influenced by the Harlem Renaissance. His earlier works that he'll do will be also depicting African American history. So these are very content driven. When you look at them, there's a story behind them, and it's, like I said, it's 60 panels, so it's a really long narrative. Although the only one we're going to really be referring to is going to be the number 49, which I'll get to in a second. Some themes of his series includes the history of Harlem. He also will include the life of the Haitian revolutionary Toussaint Louverture, the American abolitionist John Brown, and the Underground Railroad leader Harriet Tubman. He was known for writing that having no Negro history makes the Negro people feel inferior to the rest of the world. And so with these works, he's trying to really document the history of the African American experience, especially during this turbulent times. He believed that African American artists had an obligation to try to undermine the black stereotypes through positive visual art adaptations, and then use abstract form of African art as well. So this is this is considered the biggest part of a series, and like I said, there is 60 panels, which chronicles mostly the Great Migration, which Lawrence's parents is going to experience when they moved from South Carolina to New Jersey. And so this panel on the right is towards the end of the series, and really, so some of the earlier ones are focusing more on the South, but this one is focusing more on the North and how African Americans were treated in the North. And so the long title of this panel, aside from number 49, is They Also Faced Discrimination in the North, although it was a much different form than what they had known in the South. So kind of a long title, it is poetic, but we can see that with the visuals that he's going to use to show division, to show isolation, to show, you know, even like a little bit of angst or anxiety. With this, they're small panels. They're only about 1 feet by 1.5 feet. And they were painted in the early 40s. And just again, there's going to be about 6 million African Americans that move between 1910 and the 1940s. And for them, they've thought, okay, we're getting out of the South, and the Jim Crow laws don't exist in the North, but there's still going to be serious racism wherever they went. So Lawrence family is going to move into Harlem in 1930, and before painting this, he actually spent months at the library researching the mass relocation of the African American community from the South to the North. He also listened to oral stories told by his parents, families, and neighbors as they traveled northward with their journeys. And he wrote that completing the text for the short narratives for each piece is supposed to serve as both titles and explanations for the 60 individual paintings that together comprise the celebrated Migration series. He used interesting materials which sort of reflect what materials would be available to someone that would be discriminated against or African American. It's actually going to be tempera and then on hard board. So, you know, he's not using canvas, he's not using acrylics, he's using the cheap materials, and he does it on purpose, again, to say that this is what's available for African Americans. And he uses the descriptive titles, the vibrant patterns, and blocks of color. And he also simplifies the figures so that they're angular, and uses their forms to distill an epic narrative into powerful, direct images. He sketched them out on pencil in a row before he started applying paint to them. And he did this on purpose because he wanted there to be continuity throughout the piece. All 60 pieces, and so for wherever there was yellow, the yellow should be the same, or the gold, or the brown, or the green, all of it. Like, so it's almost like what Monet did when he was doing his Trying to Catch the Light with the Water Lily series, but this is for a different reason. He wanted there to be continuity of colors, so it could be read like read like a story. So, let's see. He said, I had a very simple palette. I went through all the panels painting yellows, greens, blues, so they're all the same. He didn't mix color. He said, I left it pure as it was because I wanted the series to be a unit. I consider it one work, not 60 works. So he has boldly abstracted the silhouetted style of most of his works with flat, bright shapes and colors, lots of geometric shapes and flat planes of color. We could see that especially in number 49 with the gray background, where there's no real sense of atmospheric perspective or depth. It just having them placed up higher means that they're located further away, which doesn't really show that atmospheric perspective, and that was done on purpose. And so it helps draw attention to a narrative rather than form. For number 49, the yellow rope creates a spatial divide along racial lines in this, what appears to be a dining hall. And it also helps like follow our eyes so that at each point as it zigzags, it stops at one of the figures so that we can look at each one of them individually. So again, like a narrative. There's a steep aerial perspective, meaning we're looking down on this cafe or place that they're eating, and that enhances the reading of this as because the world's out of balance. For the white figures, the facial features are there. However, they seem somewhat either indifferent or menacing, especially the guy that's lower with the big hands, and he looks angry and, you know, even scary looking. And the other guy with his back turned to the African American side, he seems just like it's not in his existence. He's just completely ignoring the group that's behind him. But for the African American figures, there's a sense of isolation. We don't see their faces. They're looking down. They're hunched over. And that is kind of the way that he's trying to express that they lacked human contact and felt a sense of isolation. So even with his simplicity of forms, almost geometric, we get this sense of despair on the figures of the right because of those slumped heads and shoulders. Their shoulders are being almost at a higher level, so it tries to show them that they're hunched over. So one of the themes he expresses is, you know, they were promised this better life in the North, but was it a better life? And that was the kind of thing that was happening and how they were feeling, especially after World War I happened, and the racism that ignited in the cities after during the 1920s and 1930s before the civil rights movement happened. So he also, Jacob Lawrence, is inspired by other artists who's using interest in the working class and the downtrodden. So it's similar to like Rivera or Goya in that he's trying to show the experience of the average person. In 1941, he is going to break a great racial barrier because he is going to be the first African American artist whose work was acquired by the Museum of Modern Art in New York, or MoMA. They are going to purchase half of this series, and the other half of the series is going to be placed in another museum in New York. So the even figures or even pieces are going to be in MoMA, and the odd pieces are going to be in a different museum. So we don't get to see the narrative as it's told by Jacob Lawrence, but if you were to look at them all at once on the computer, you could. This, for me, I find it very fascinating just because I taught U.S. history for so long, because I did teach about the Great Migration and the Harlem Renaissance, and so he is definitely a part of that narrative and also leads to more of an awakening that led ultimately to the Civil Rights Movement. So he's one of our most prominent African American artists that we're going to feature with the art history curriculum. If you guys have time, the Khan Academy video on this, they do a great job explaining it and going over the details. There's actually 2 short videos on Khan Academy. Well, one's 5 minutes, the other's 10, but it is worth your time looking at it if you find this fascinating or interesting, because I do, and I think the videos are good. So, all right, so here's Jacob Lawrence's The Migration series.